as I have said before, I think this year is going to be quite a big year for some Brexit news. After all, there is going to be a lot of talks and negotiations around sort of the withdrawal agreement, and ultimately some back and forthing, to and throwing between the two sides. However, as I've made very, very clear before, we've got a brand new party that isn't, shall we say, as ideologically fixed to a free market fundamentalist position that, wants to help improve Britain's, economy and its growth, and will look towards the European Union as a way of achieving that. And they have laid that out. We have seen Starmer almost immediately as he won the general election. Both him and David Lammy went on a charm offensive in Europe and were constantly met with open arms and offers. Most notably, of course, the youth mobility scheme that keeps on coming up time and time again. This is an issue that keeps on coming up. And yet, as I've always said, Starmer hasn't said anything about what he wants from these upcoming negotiations or anything like that. Because, again, doesn't actually have to say anything until he walks into that room. Now, we also know that he is currently in the job market for a new Brexit negotiator. And rather than making this a political appointment, like, a Lord Frost, which is basically Boris Johnson going, "You'll do, there you go, job's on." This is actually a full formal interview process. There is a whole department now made, dubbed the Surrender Squad, of course, by the right-wing press. However, it is this group of people that are in charge and going to be negotiating our relationship with the EU from now on. And it is going to be very, very important who takes that role. Make no mistake, whoever picks this role, whoever gets selected, is probably in the first open month or something like that, is going to be, massively jumped on by the right-wing press and etc. Quote, for testing their Brexit, purity testing them ultimately. Wouldn't surprise me. In fact, I would be very interested to see whoever gets picked having a look at their first interview, and would be definitely be very interested to see what they have to say in and around that. Ultimately, I would suspect how press open they are going to be. After all, technically, they're going to be a civil servant, meaning that they will have to go through, civil service channels to do interviews and things like that. But it's not beyond the realms of possibility that they are at some point going to do an interview. When they do eventually do one, we will be covering it, because I think it will be very, very interesting to see. And I think, once again, you're going to see a night and day transition between our previous government, who basically pretended the EU wasn't there and just didn't want to deal with them whatsoever, to a government that actually is interested in the EU. It is interested in talking to them. It is, and has shown willingness to work and cooperate with the EU on a couple of things. So again, a lot of stuff probably going to happen. A lot of stuff going to be happening this year in and around that. But there are, of course, a couple of concerns, because it turns out that the former Vote Leave chair, someone by the name of Gisela Stuart, is going to be involved in helping to recruit this new negotiator. And she was part of the Vote Leave. She was the chief of Vote Leave, in fact. So quite rightly, this has a lot of people worried that she is going to be purity testing whoever gets picked on this. And as, again, this article does itself point out later on, you can't have someone who is ideologically motivated. We've seen the damage that can do throughout from 2016, going from, I was going to say Greg Davis then, but no, David Davis, all the way up to Lord Frost. All those people were very, very much ideologically motivated, believing in the free market fundamentalist fantasy promises that the Brexit Kool-Aid was telling them that it offered. And the worrying point is that this person is in charge, not fully in charge of this, interview process, bear in mind, but she will have a say. And this was even brought up by Starmer in opposition. In fact, he even wrote a letter Let me get to it. Where was this thing here? So where is it? Yes, so here it is. So Starmer actually wrote a letter back when he was leader of the opposition, questioning, of course, her impartiality on this. She said, or at least he said, she is too closely politically connected to the current Conservative government and has campaigned with many of them on important political matters that are now still relevant to the challenges faced by departments, as Starmer wrote to the Cabinet Office at the time. He said this means that there are now questions over whether she is actually in a position to provide advice and oversight that is independent, impartial, and objective. Her appointment, of course, as the first civil servant commissioner raises, of course, similar questions. And some MPs on the House of Commons Public Affairs Administration do scrutinise her, did express their reservations. So we will actually see what will happen on this. But she is in charge. She has oversight on this role, but she's not fully in charge. And there is, of course, questions, could Starmer fire her? Well, not really, because you'd actually have to, first of all, have a good reason. You can't just go, well, I'm firing you because you were put in, a position by, Boris Johnson. And even though, of course, Starmer did express reservations at the time, there was a committee that came in, looked at it, and said, you know what, there you go. So you can't just go around and just fire a civil servant just like that, unless you actually have solid proof that she hasn't been, impartial, objective in this area and regards. And so far, there has been no evidence of that sort. So while this has, I think, quite rightly spooked a lot of people, a lot of pro-Europeans about her position that she has input, who is going to be picking this new Brexit negotiator, she hasn't full control over this process. She is not the only voice in the room, and as we know right now, those interviews that has sort of started now. So it is very likely, maybe, again, depending how long this process takes, maybe mid-February, maybe end of February, maybe even early March, where we hear who takes this position. And trust me, a lot of right-wing press are going to jump on these people or this person that gets this job almost immediately. And you will see, of course, them applying the Brexit purity test. But we'll see. But it is something to worth bear in mind that this person has a say, who is, of course, picking this new Brexit negotiator. Like I say, and Starmer can't just go and fire her because there is no against current evidence to say that she hasn't been impartial or objective or anything like that, especially when she's been sort of giving her advice in her sort of civil service role. And remember, she was approved by a committee, even though, as it said, there were sort of reservations about that. So unless there is, can't really get rid of her on that front. But it is something worth pointing out that this is someone who is in charge of selecting the new Brexit negotiator. Bear in mind, she doesn't have full control, so she can't, shoot down anyone unanimously. There is a panel, but we don't know who else is on that panel, at least for the time being, and who gets to choose the input of this. So we'll see what happens, and we'll see who gets the job eventually. But I am glad at least Starmer is taking this, that has sort of made it a civil service role, that at least depoliticizes it a bit. Again, it won't fully depoliticize it because, as we've seen, the Daily Mail has labeled this unit the Surrender Squad. It just needs a new boss, and we'll see who ends up taking it over. And like I say, probably in a couple of months' time, we'll find out on that front. And then maybe once they're in position, we might actually start to see Starmer come forward and say what he actually wants to achieve from these negotiations. Because as I've said, Starmer doesn't have to say a thing until pretty much they walk into that room. So we'll see what happens. But as I've said before, 2025 are going to be another big year, probably, for talking about Brexit and what could happen in and around that front. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.